Okay, I hope you see my screen.
Yes.
Yeah, we see it.
Okay, so welcome to the second day of our conference, Sino-Indo-Hellenica 2022. And the first presentation on the schedule is my own, The Origins of Kingship in Ancient Greek and Indian Literary Traditions. The question of the extent to which ideas were diffused between the ancient Greek and Indian cultural spheres before the Hellenistic age is debated. In fact, the possibility of a pre-Hellenistic transfusion has often been confined to the realm of far-flung ideas. In this presentation, I argue against the grain that political ideas did travel between Greece and India, both before and after Alexander crossed the Indus in 326 BC, and that the transfusion in question influenced the formation of theories of the origins of kingship in ancient Greece and India, respectively. So, where do we encounter these early theories of kingship in ancient Greece and India? And what makes us think that they could be connected? To begin with the Greek side, we find an early kingship theory in the so-called Medicos logos, which is Herodotus' account of the rise and fall of the Median Empire. Here, Herodotus retells the story of Deioces, the first king of the Medes. In the beginning of Herodotus' story, the great amount of lawlessness witnessed in the land of the Medes when Deioces was elected to be their king is underlined. And then if we turn to the Indian literary evidence, we may begin by looking at the Arthashastra, which is the most famous ancient Indian work on statecraft and economics. Here we find in Book 1, Chapter 13, a restatement of the Herodotan idea that in a state of anarchy, or as the story here goes, when the law of the fish prevails, then the people may elect a king. Now, if it had been restricted to a single isolated correspondence, reciprocity of this sort would obviously not suffice to warrant the postulation of cross-cultural transfusion. However, the parallel becomes considerably more intriguing when we take into account that both the histories and the Arthashastra depict their respective kings as having taken pains to ensure that spies were stationed throughout the kingdom. And as I will show later in this presentation, there are also a number of other parallel thought contents and shared motives to be found in the narrative details of these early Greek and Indian texts. Taken together, these parallels suggest that some kind of interdependence between the Greek and Indian accounts actually obtained. What is more, we encounter very similar ideas also in another early Indian literary source, namely in the Aganna Sutta. This text forms the 27th book of the Digha Nikaya collection, a collection which contains the earliest canonical accounts of the life of the Buddha. And here we find an exposition of the origins of kingship too, and one which I would claim forms even a more clearly recognizable counterpart to the Herodotan account in the Deioces episode. So the research questions evoked, and which I will try to answer, are thus the following. Was there cross-cultural communication at the root of the apparent mutual mirroring encountered in the early Greek and Indian theories of the origins of kingship? If so, what was the direction of influence, and how did the respective Greek and Indian text respond to the foreign stimulus? Finally, how was it possible that political ideas were exchanged between these geographically widely separated cultural spheres before the time of the conquests of Alexander the Great? Okay, turning to methodology then. In this presentation, I will try to answer the above research questions by means of a multimodal approach containing of 3 parts. On the one hand, I will make use of a traditional historical philological method, where the focus lies on the semantic content of the investigated literary passages. A philological method of this kind strives to deduce from the textual context in focus the modes of reasoning and forms of thought that the investigated passages bear witness to. Based on a determination of the thought contents of the texts, then the historical hypothesis proposed here, which is that a mutual exchange of political ideas took place between ancient India and Greece even before the Hellenistic age, may then be either weakened or strengthened. This historical philological method will, on the other hand, be amended with the use of modern literary theory, and specifically with the theories of transtextuality developed by Gerard Genette. This method will be employed here in order to determine the relations of hypotext, or earlier source text, and hypertext, or later alluding text, prevailing between the parallel passages in the respective Greek and Indian literary traditions. A specific focus here lies on Genette's notion of transformation, namely a textual relation where the hypertext can be seen to derive from the hypotext to the extent that the existence of the later text is made possible by the earlier text. In addition, I will make use of Northrop Frye's concept of the literary archetype, namely a communicable unit or recurring image that connects one text with another and unifies the reader's understanding of the texts. And finally, I will later also strive to assess the feasibility of pre-Hellenistic diffusion of political ideas between the ancient Greek and Indian cultural spheres more generally. This I will do by applying comparative methodology to further support the conclusion that some transfusion likely did take place. However, this last part of the investigation will not be presented here due to lack of time. So, we may begin by proposing a provisional working hypothesis, which may then be either strengthened or weakened by our findings. This hypothesis states that the Digha Nikaya, and specifically the Agana Sutta, contains material that is earlier, alternatively roughly contemporary with the parts of the histories under scrutiny here. Whereas the passages in focus in the Artha Shastra are likely to have been contrived at the earliest some centuries later. So the direction of influence will have moved originally from the Indian cultural sphere to the Greek and then possibly back towards the Indian. So next I will try this hypothesis against readings of our texts, and we will look at the core parts of the respective theories of the beginnings of kingship that these texts contain. Okay, here we have the Digha Nikaya, or the Agana Sutta first. Then Vasetta those beings went to the being among them, who was the handsomest, the best favored, the most attractive, the most capable, and said to him, "Come now, good being, be indignant at that whereat one should rightly be indignant. Censure that which should rightly be censured. Banish him who deserves to be banished. And we will contribute to thee a proportion of our rice." And he consented, and did so. And they gave him a proportion of their rice. Chosen by the whole people, Vasetta, is what is meant by Mahasammata. So Mahasammata, the great elect, was the first standing phrase to arise for such an one. Then we turn to the histories, the Deioces episode. When the men of the other towns learned that Deioces alone gave fair judgments, having before suffered from unjust decisions, they came often and gladly to plead before Deioces. And at last they would submit to no arbitration but his. Then Deioces, seeing that everything now depended on him, would not sit in his former seat of judgment, and said he would give no more decisions. For it was of no advantage to him, he said, to leave his own business and spend all day judging the cases of his neighbors. This caused robbery and lawlessness to increase greatly in the towns. And gathering together, the Medes conferred about their present affairs and said, here, as I suppose the main speaker were Deioces' friends, "Since we cannot go on living in the present way in the land, come, let us set up a king over us. In this way the land will be well governed, and we ourselves shall attend to our business and not be rooted by lawlessness." With such words, they persuaded themselves to be ruled by a king. The question was at once propounded, whom should they make king? Then every man was loud in putting Deioces forward and praising Deioces until they agreed that he should be their king. Okay, finally we have the account of the Untitled Chapter, book 1. Classmate spies formed as opposing factions shall carry on disputations in places of pilgrimage, in assemblies, houses, corporations, and amid congregations of people. One spy may say, "This king is said to be endowed with all desirable qualities. He seems to be a stranger to such tendencies as would lead him to oppress citizens and country people by levying heavy fines and taxes." Against those who seem to commend this opinion, another spy may interrupt the speaker and say, "People suffering from anarchy, as illustrated by the proverbial tendency of a larger fish swallowing a small one, first elected Manu, the Vaivasvata, to be their king, and allotted 1/6 of the grains grown and 1/10 of the merchandise as sovereign dues. Fed by this payment, kings took upon themselves the responsibility of maintaining the safety and security of their subjects, and of being answerable for the sins of their subjects when the principle of levying just punishments and taxes has been violated." So, what does the above expositions of the beginnings of kingly rule have in common? Clearly, it's the presumption that the coming to power of the first king was preceded by a serious state of social disorder. In the Agana Sutta, the Buddha explains to the young Brahmin Vasetta that it was stealing, censure, and lying that first made the people realize their need for a sovereign dispenser of punishments. According to the Buddha, the sole ruler was subsequently given the names the Great Elect, Katya, and Raya, which are all titles for kings. In the Untitled Chapter, on the other hand, a secret agent denotes the state of social disorder preceding the election of the initial king, Manu, with the figure of the law of the fish. And finally, a parallel idea is also given expression to in the Deioces episode. Here, the narrator focalizes the great lawlessness which prevailed in the land of the Medes when Deioces first started his career. The Herodotean story, however, includes a twist which is not present in the Indian accounts. The twist is that Deioces is not made king right away. Rather, he uses a clever trick to persuade the people to settle him in his position. He refuses to practice justice if they do not give him sovereign power. So are we not then dealing here with a separate story altogether? At first glance, it may actually seem that the respective Greek and Indian expositions of the beginnings of kingly rule, although they share the basic structure of lawlessness being defeated by a sovereign ruler, are in fact quite dissimilar. Most importantly, Herodotus' account appears to contain elements which are completely missing in the Indian versions, because Deioces begins his career as a locally functioning judge, then extends his jurisdiction to cover also other village communities, and then resigns, since he knows that this will result in renewed lawlessness, which will eventually secure his election as king. However, in the Agana Sutta and the Artha Shastra, the kingly order seems to be established more immediately. So we may ask if Herodotus' account may actually form a reaction against the Indian versions of the theory. Could this be the case? Well, the usual scholarly reading of the Deioces episode sees the story as an exposition of specific Greek rather than any foreign forms of despotic rule. To mention a few examples of previous readings, the Deioces episode has been read as a critique of Greek tyrannical rule in the sense of a prefiguration of constitutional philosophy. Deioces himself has been seen as a ruler whose goal-orientedness and techniques of conquest clearly single him out as a Greek tyrant. And the whole purpose of the episode has been assumed to be that of an attempt at defining the nature of tyranny as such. Now, it should be duly noted that these readings are also, in fact, grounded in evidence. For instance, we find in another classical Greek text touching on the question of the origins of tyranny, the anonymous Jambliki, a mirroring of the idea of lawlessness as a forerunner to tyranny, since here it's stated that tyranny rises from nothing else than lawlessness. And it's certainly worthy of notice too that Deioces is said to have been granted spear-bearing bodyguards, while the Athenian 6th century BC tyrant Pisistratus is expressly claimed by Herodotus to have preferred a guard of club bearers to spear bearers. In other words, the case seems to be well made for a reading of Deioces as a Greek tyrant par excellence. And I do think it's likely that Herodotus' intention was actually to present Deioces exactly as a character that would invite his Greek audiences to draw parallels between the first Median king and their own autocrats. However, this does not preclude the possibility that the Herodotan account drew heavily on various foreign expositions of kingship too. And that this is a genuine possibility is suggested by the measures Deioces takes after having been elected king. Actually, the most easily recognizable foreign influences detectable in the Deioces episode stem from ancient Persia. For example, the summer residency of the Achaemenid rulers, Ekbatana, is made the capital of Deioces' new kingdom. And Achaemenid court etiquette may be identified in the rules set down by Deioces that no one was to be allowed to spit or laugh in the presence of the king. However, other details in the Deioces story clearly have their closest parallels in the Indian literary tradition. For instance, one of the measures Deioces takes to secure his rule is to station spies throughout his kingdom. This ordinance we find repeated in the Artha Shastra, where the importance of positioning spies in strategic places all over the land is underlined on several occasions. Moreover, Deioces is also said to have been the first to establish the rule that no one was to come into the presence of the king, since the king was to be seen by no one. And this in turn seems to echo an ancient Indian conception ascribing ultimate untouchability to the body of the king. Thus, in the Manu Smriti, for example, the claim is made that the king, like the sun, burns eyes and minds, so that it becomes impossible for anyone on earth to even gaze at him. However, these parallels, although significant in themselves, are insufficient to warrant the conclusion that Herodotus' account was directly influenced by Indian sources. Since we can think of a variety of ways in which the Greek and Indian literary traditions came to incorporate parallel contents like the above, without them necessarily borrowing from each other. Maybe Herodotus' account was based on a stereotypical Greek notion of an Eastern type of monarch, which would include the ideas that the king had a palace encircled by multiple walls, that he was surrounded by bodyguards, that spies were stationed throughout his kingdom, and that he himself was somehow concealed. However, together with the shared basic assumption, which we have encountered versions of in all the Greek and Indian sources we have looked at so far, namely the idea that kingly rule followed on a state of lawlessness, the parallels accounted for here at least support the conclusion that the early Greek and Indian theories of the origins of kingship drew on a common archetype, or a communicable unit in the sense of Northrop Frye, which in this case is formed by a prototypical theory that recurs in our Greek and Indian texts. And as it seems, this prototypical theory of the origins of kingship actually moved originally from India to Greece, as I will argue for now. So far, we have noted that the accounts of the origins of kingship encountered in our Indian sources exclude certain narrative parts that we find fully exposed in the histories. Nevertheless, it's clear that much of what Herodotus tells us about Deioces' activities as judge and king is directly paralleled in both the Aggana Sutta and the Artha Shastra. Especially we encounter in all three of these expositions the idea that the first king was righteous in his practice of justice, that it was his good judgments that justified his election as king, and that in return for his excellent work as a judge, the people granted him certain privileges. Actually, it seems that the main addition of Herodotus' account, when compared to our Indian versions, is precisely that of splitting the narrative into two stages. First judge, then king. I have shown elsewhere that this splitting of the narrative probably served a purpose, namely that of exposing the self-created nature of Deioces' rule. But where does this leave us regarding the question of the direction of influence? So far, I have argued that the common archetype formed the basis of both the Greek and Indian accounts of the origins of kingly rule. However, the new splitting of the narrative, which we encounter in the histories, surely also warrants the assumption that the Deioces episode presents us with a further development of this archetypal account, since a more basic form of it is found in our Indian sources. If this is admitted, the hypothesis of the theory of the beginnings of kingship, moving originally from the direction of the ancient Indian cultural sphere towards the Greek, is strengthened. But what about the further possibility that the influence was in fact mutual? That is, that the Greek developments to the theory also influenced the Indian literary tradition. First of all, it should be noted that of our Indian sources, it is the Agana Sutta, which contains the version of the theory of the origins of kingship, which likely lies closest to the archetypal account. Because here, the theory forms part of a supposedly historical myth of how the Buddhist hierarchical social model, with its characteristic privileged place granted to ascetic Buddhist monks, came to be instituted. The account of the Agana Sutta thus presents a kind of legitimizing historical allegory, the underlying function of which is likely to have been that of solidifying the Buddhist social order. The narrative can, of course, contain humorous or satirical elements too, and perhaps the account was never even intended to be historically accurate. But it is nevertheless presented in the form of morally pregnant myth historical fact. We may hence conclude that the version encountered in the Agana Sutta mirrors that of an original mythical narration, which contained a historicizing legitimation of the institution of kingship as part of the social order. However, as we turn our focus to the version of the theory encountered in the Arthashastra, we may note that this historically allegorizing function has undergone a transformation. Because what we encounter here is an exposition which is no longer presented in the form of factual myth history. Instead, the theory is here presented by a spy who, by accounting for it, performs his service to the king. More specifically, the spy's mission is to support the gathering of fines and taxes by sowing confusion among the people who oppose them. The spy thus recounts his version of the theory, which involves the idea of the king's right to taxation and fining, in order to counter the conception of an ideal ruler conceived of as one who abstains from such measures. Consequently, we find that the theory of the origins of kingship has here actually been stripped of its historicity. In other words, what was still presented as factual myth history in the Agana Sutta has in the Arthashastra been overtly admitted of as forming just another tool designed for use by the ruler to solidify his rule. This transition could perhaps be accounted for in terms of the kind of secular attitude which has been taken to define the Arthashastra in general, namely an admittance of the Machiavellian right of the ruler to exploit all social and religious powers for his own benefit. This kind of thorough demythization of kingly rule seems, however, to presuppose a recognition of the arbitrary nature of the institution of kingship. Should we presume then that a foreign influence worked in the background of the rising of this awareness within the Indian cultural sphere too? This question will be left hanging for now. The time has now come for a summary. The readings conducted here proceeded from the working hypothesis that the Agana Sutta and the histories present us with roughly contemporary material, whereas the Arthashastra stems from a somewhat later age. It was then argued that all three narrative sections in focus here likely derived from a common archetypal theory, which accounted for the institution of kingship as part of the social order. Thereafter, it was concluded that of our three accounts, the Agana Sutta probably lies closest to the archetypal theory. The histories, on the other hand, was shown to have deviated from the archetype in that it introduced a splitting of the narrative, which arguably marked a reaction against the mythologizing of kingly rule evidenced in the Agana Sutta. Finally, the question left hanging was if not the heightened awareness of the arbitrary nature of kingship that the Arthashastra in turn demonstrates implies some form of socio-intellectual acquisition stemming from non-Indian sources. The most likely candidate for the origins of this sort of possible influence would be the ancient Greek cultural sphere, since here a range of alternatives to monarchic regimes, as well as to all other autocratic governmental forms, had been acknowledged at least ever since the beginning of the classical age. Moreover, here, unlike in India and neighboring cultural spheres, political theories conceiving of different constitutional alternatives as humanly created entities had also been developed. In the Arthashastra, on the other hand, there are no options to kingly rule explicitly admitted of. However, real-world alternatives to monarchic governmental forms, for instance, different forms of oligarchic regimes, may have existed on the tribal level in ancient India too. Hence, we are not in a position to prove conclusively that the account of the origins of kingship in the Arthashastra has been externally influenced. Okay, time has now come for the presentation of a theory in terms of transtextuality of the nature of influence between the early Greek and Indian literary traditions. In this presentation, I have argued that we may assume a common archetype for the accounts of the origins of kingship found in early Greek and Indian literary traditions. Moreover, I have shown that the Agana Sutta likely lies closest to this prototypical theory. In terms of transtextual literary criticism, the account of the Agana Sutta may thus be taken to represent the original hypotext, on which the hypertext represented by our two other accounts, those of the histories and the Arthashastra, have been contrived. Now, the relationship prevailing between the hypotext and the hypertexts are in this case of a kind where the hypertexts may be seen to have been derived from the hypotext through a process of transformation. The concept of transformation should be understood here as a relation where the derived text could not have come into existence without the pre-existent text. In all actuality, this kind of relationship seems to prevail between our texts, since as we have seen, not only do they share the basic premise of kingly rule having followed on a state of lawlessness, but also a number of other thought contents and literary motives. But can we say something more specific about the nature of change that the hypotext in this case has undergone? Within the theoretical framework of transtextuality, we actually find an element by which these transformations may be described. This is the concept of devaluation or demystification. The devaluation is in our cases directed against an earlier myth-historical account, that of the Agana Sutta, which in its original shapes seems mostly to have had positive implications. In its original form, the theory of the origins of kingship functions as a sort of transhistorically necessary basis of the social order. In the case of the histories, the devaluation of this image of kingly rule was then obtained through a splitting of the narrative into the two distinct stages of judge and king. This splitting then caused the recognition of the self-made nature of Deioces' rule. In the Arthashastra, on the other hand, a demystification of the original account is carried through by means of the narrative structure. Since here the theory of the beginnings of kingship has been placed in the mouth of a spy who recounts it in full awareness of the myth's mundane origins and purpose. In conclusion, it may be stated that the histories and the Arthashastra both bear evidence of a transformation in shape of a devaluation, alternatively demystification, of an archetypal theory of the origins of kingship, the original form of which seems to have been most closely mirrored in the Agana Sutta. What remains to be decided is whether or not this shared pattern implies an actual transmission of ideas between ancient Greece and India. And for this purpose, comparative mythology will be employed. Thank you. Questions or comments?
I have a question.
Okay, who wants to? I didn't see who was first, but let's take Sergio first. I just happened to see him first on the screen.
Too kind. Sorry again. Wonderful presentation, and I deeply appreciated even the conclusive remarks about the narrator of the theory in each of the two versions, which I think is a wonderful observation, the contextualization of the theory. I mean, in which way the theory was differently biased and contextualized in the two works. I was wondering if you have been reasoning about, you mentioned that actually, a common origin, instead of from India to Greece, a proto-Indo-European theory of kingship, which embodied itself in a literary form in the Arthashastra for the Indian tradition and in the histories for the Greek tradition in an independent way and through many streams, of course, but the parallelism between the two theories might be due to the common origin. You referred to the two versions or to the common origin as a sort of urtext, the hypertext, the hypotext archetype. It's difficult maybe to use those terms because they imply texts, specific texts, and Lachmanian philology when we say hypertext and hypotext. Well, on the contrary, I'm thinking of history of the ideas, and ideas fluctuate in different forms than sheer texts, oral literature, and stuff. So instead of it from India to Greece hypothesis, a common origin, a proto-Indo-European one.
Yes, I admit the possibility of that. It's like it can certainly not be excluded. There's certainly the possibility that both of these or all three of these versions, the two Indians and the one Greek that I have been looking at, that they all derive from an unknown third source. And since the Greek and Indian traditions have a common origin, or the people have a common Indo-European origin, that's of course a possibility. But I have also looked at the earlier accounts of the origins of kingship. So for instance, we have in the Babylonian myth of origins, the Enuma Elish, we have an account of the origins of kingship as well, but that is completely on the level of gods. But the idea of social disorder preceding the institution of kingship in the godly sphere exists there as well. So this common idea is certainly something that we find elsewhere as well, but it's just that these Greek and Indian theories, they are mirror each other in a very specific way, that I haven't found anywhere else. And I think that they have been developed at a later point, let's say so, because there is this idea of the beginnings of king rule taking place completely on the human level. There are no gods involved and so on. It's well, I can prove that there is not a third unknown source, earlier source from which they both derive. That's certainly a possibility. I hope this answered your question to some extent, at least. Okay, Ronald.
You did, and thank you once more for your presentation.
Thanks for your question. Ronald.
I think that Jordan is ahead of me. I'm the third, and Patrick is first. I think maybe we can just fit in line.
Can I just take you in the order that I see you on the screen? So if you start, it's easier for me because I have a certain order.
Okay, okay.
You guys are there, so.
Okay, yeah, okay. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Otto. So at the beginning of your slide, you say that the Indian historical materials is notoriously difficult to date. So my question is, why these Indian historians, they tend to ignore these historical dates, and if they ignore these dates, what other features they pay attention to focus? Yeah.
Well, it's not that. If I understood your question correctly, you said that. Do you mean that contemporary Indian historians ignore the dates, or that the
ancient?
I don't think that. Actually, I'm not the right person to answer this question. I can just say that the reason why the Indian literary works are so extremely difficult to date. On the one hand, the reason for this is that literacy was introduced at a quite late date in ancient India in general, and on the other hand, they just didn't have, like, for instance, when we date ancient Greek texts, we have for instance, specific dates that we can, for the Athenian evidence, that we can base on the fact that there's some eponymous archons and stuff like this. So you don't have that much of this external material dating that you can base your datings on. So there is a lack of this sort of evidence that you can conclusively state that, okay, this literary work must have been produced within these termini. You know, the terminis are much wider, and adding up to this is the fact that the scholars themselves really have been able to come to any kind of consensus when it comes to dating these literary works. So you find very widely among scholars, you find very wide diffusion of different dates. So it's, for instance, the Arthashastra. I've been reading quite a lot of scholarly works on trying to date the Arthashastra, and there's no consensus whatsoever. Some say it's 500 BC, some say it's 500 AD, and then you have everything in between. And there is different arguments, but there is no conclusive way of coming to a common ground. I mean, it would be, if you could even give 100 years termini, that within these 100 years, that would help a lot, but you don't have it. Instead, you have 1,000 years within which it could actually have been contrived, the work. So, Patrick.
Thank you.
Yes, first of all, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, and I really enjoy it. That I feel there is a very important approach, and also I would say it's quite, you have a great research taste for finding such a topic. And I actually have I have two things. One is the comments. One is the comments of your presentation. Like I just remember something, and another one will be actually I have some thoughts about Rona's question. So I was thinking about something maybe completely irrelevant, but it fits in your methodology of the cross-cultural transtextuality, that there are some later sources, and the first one I actually reminded is called Milinda Panna. So it is the Buddhist Sutra that talks about the Hellenistic king Menander and then in Sanskrit is Milinda. So how he converted to Buddhism, and how and you could find out that there are some historical writings about him. I'll just type it. So this, for example, this is the reference that I come through, like how Indian writing that talks about the kind of Greek kingship look like. So I would say this may be a kind of counter examples that talk about how a Greek king and fit into this Indian context. So maybe that would be useful.
For sure.
And
for sure.
For Rona's question, actually, I have a little bit of thought of, because yeah, I remember there is a hypothesis that talk about Indian doesn't have a kind of, their sense of time is different. We think the, maybe like Westerners think the time is like linear or something. Indian may think the time is like cyclic. So there is no end of development, no end of time, and it kind of repetitively. So this may be, I would say, hypothesis, maybe why they are kind of lack of sense of what date it is.
Yeah.
And sorry?
It is based on this theory, so they can invent the concept of the number 0, the circle.
Maybe, yes. And another thing is, another note is what they call about them. You may check the theory called the oral epic tradition. So sadly, like India is the case that they have a lot of oral tradition that takes long. And when there is not written, when everything is not written, and there, you mean everyone who reads it and becomes kind of, recomposer of those, let's say, epics and tales. And this comes to be just like a unsolid text. So I think that sort of theory may also fit into, why this like lack of time things may happen.
Thank you.
For sure. But then there are some works where there is more consensus on the dating. So some of the Upanishads and stuff like this, they have been come to a more of a consensus. So it's, but others not, like for instance, when it comes to the Arthashastra, there's absolutely no consensus when it comes to dating. Yeah. Saoi.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Otto. Very enjoyable presentation for me. Especially, it's not my ground, but I'm very fascinating about the theme itself, truly. And it's talking about this comparison between the political thought of the Greek and the Indians may remind me about their, connection, geographical connection in the first place. And also, you mentioned one thing about the dating of Arthashastra. It's really interesting and also important for me. Especially, you say that the terminus antiquum there's a theory that it is in the 5th century AD. And I'm very interested for this because in my opinion, I think that Arthashastra is maybe no later than the 2nd century BC. And I wonder if you can, if you remembered this theory about the later dating.
Well, I actually have a version.
How can I find the paper of this theory?
I have a version of this paper in peer review, which also includes all the parts that I omitted from this presentation. And I also deal with the dating of the Arthashastra there. So there's 2 pages on the dating of the Arthashastra there. So I have references to all of these different scholars there. So maybe I can just send you that paper and you can look up that those references there if you're interested. But what I can say now is that it seems anyway that in later scholarship there is a tendency to down date the latest reduction of the Arthashastra to a later period. And for instance, it has been claimed that the Arthashastra structurally very much resembles the Kama Sutra, and the Kama Sutra is dated usually to the 3rd or 4th century AD, so they must have been quite close to each other. But then Arthashastra, on the other hand, is thought to have been, by many scholars nowadays, is thought to have been more of a composite work. So the latest reduction probably has as its basis and earlier versions, which then also may be in themselves composite works. So, I mean, it's a very complex work, just like Herodotus' histories, except that Herodotus' histories, of course, was written by one person, whereas there are those who believe that Arthashastra also had a single composer, but at least as many scholars who believe that actually it's a composite work, which then was redacted and given an
So a long duration
unified composition at some point, which was probably a bit later, around 2nd or 3rd centuries AD. So yeah, but I can even
so the final version.
you can look up the. I have some references there and a discussion of the dating of about 2 pages. So you may find something of use there.
Yeah, that will be very helpful. And thank you for this, because I realized that the older dating of Arthashastra always been a very old, the very old sources relate to the if the first time to say the 4th or 5th century BC. That is a very old theory of the Arthashastra, but then nowadays scholars more and more related to close to the nowadays state. So
yeah, but I don't think there is
a very
consensus.
complicated thing.
There is not a consensus for the later dating either, not even in New York scholarship. But yes, the pre-Marian date is probably a bit out. That view of dating is probably a bit outdated. I don't think there's that many who actually believe that the Arthashastra was pre-Mauryan. The Mauryan Empire was like around 200 BC. So the ones who believe that it actually preceded are probably in a very small minority nowadays.
Yeah. So thank you, Professor, and very hope to see this references. Yeah, and that's all.
Send it to you. Thank you. Okay, did anyone else have any questions? Jordan, did you have a question or?
Yeah. I guess it's an unanswerable question because you guys are just talking about how undateable this text is. My question concerned what the actual historical conditions were in India around the time of this text's composition or prior to it, which I guess is impossible if the range is 1,000 years. But I mean, I'd point out that for the Greeks, the entire concept of the basileus evolves out of the Mycenaean, like quasi-reu, right? It's a position that becomes kingship in what could be described as like a post-apocalyptic situation, right? The Greeks describing a situation of anarchy and people just having to take control and become kings makes historical sense, even if they're describing it from other people. It's more or less what we think happened, at least the current scholarship that I've been reading about the fall of Mycenae is arguing that's what happened. So I mean, I'm wondering if this is equally plausible for India, or if we just can't say anything for India, so this wouldn't really matter at all.
Well, I mean, the theory of kingship that we find in Agana Sutta, their kingship is sort of part of the caste system, So the kings are just one social group among many social groups, but it has an important, the kingship or the institution of the king has a very important function to play in this social system, because it's the king is the one who sort of guarantees that the order of the society will be maintained. But in the Agana Sutta, there are also all these other social classes or main social classes, and the Brahmin classes, of course, there, the kingship class is there, but then there are also the Buddhist recluses as an own class. So the ascetic Buddhist monks are also part of this social system, and they are given a privileged position. So they are actually like considered the the highest social order. But anyway, you get the sensation that because the king is the first one in this historical allegory, the first social class which is established, and based on that, the other classes then they find their place as well in the system. So that's why I mentioned kingship as being a sort of order guarantee, or like an historically necessary component in the social system for order to be maintained. But actually, I lost track of your question. Maybe I didn't answer it properly. Sorry.
I mean, it seems like you're
what I would say is
suggesting that
it can't be quite the same, because, and also the Basileus is there's of course the discussion which you probably know about, if whether or not the Basileus can be considered a king in any sense at all, or if it's or if he's rather some kind of tribal leader. No. So I don't think there isn't any archaic Greek theory of kingship per se, and that may be connected to the fact that there is actually not an archaic Greek institution of kingship per se, maybe. But this was speculation, because again, there might have been an archaic Greek theory of kingship. It's just that we don't know of it because it hasn't been preserved in any texts. But the earliest theory of kingship, I would say, in the ancient Greek culture sphere is the one that we have in the Deioces episode. Is it just me, or is Jordan frozen? Or is it me who is frozen? I think I disappeared for a while.
Yeah, I was wondering what is going on.
Yeah. Okay, but I hope I was able to answer your question to some extent, at least.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Let's take one final question, then we have to move on to the next presentation.
Okay, I will be very brief. First of all, thank you for this food for thought you provided. I wrote down many sources, and because I found the theme of anomia at the origin of the tyranny really intriguing, because there are also expressions really similar to yours in late Latin literature that I'm using for my project of PhD, and I'm referring to panegyrici of Claudiano in honor of Emperor Honorius. But what I want to ask you is probably related to your last answer, and is the fact that if you make some reflection about the fact that at a certain point in the Code of Manu, in the Book of Manu, the kings also grants the jurisdictional powers also to his officials as well. So in Rome, we talk about it as the Concilium Regis or Concilium Principis. So I'd like to know if you made some ideas about this leaving of the power from the king to his officials.
I haven't read that particular passage in the Laws of Manu. So, but if you could give me the references, I will look it up, because that's something that I certainly want to look up. You can send them to me,
because I think it's book 8 chapter 8 paragraph 8. And
okay.
Starting, it goes and it.
I'll look it up. I'll look
Okay.
it up, but I can't give you any answer now because I haven't read it yet. So, okay, I think that's it. Thank you for your attention, and yeah.